The way Killers of the Flower Moon wraps up is absolutely heart-wrenching. So Martin Scorsese directs this film that brings justice to the Osage Nation after enduring years of murder, theft, and mistreatment. When Tom White from the Bureau of Investigation shows up, William King Hale realizes he's in hot water and hatches a sinister plan to eliminate everyone involved in these brutal killings, including Henry Roan. But then, when they nab Blackie Thompson, he starts singing like a canary and spills the beans about who hired him. Ernest Burkhart, who initially went along with the evil scheme, ends up in cuffs and decides to testify against his own uncle. During this whole investigation, Molly Burkhart, who was literally on her deathbed after getting poisoned by her own doctors under Hale and Ernest's orders, is found and rushed to a hospital. Fortunately, she starts to recover. Molly, initially believing in Ernest's innocence, stands by her man. But her world gets turned upside down during his testimony when she learns how deeply he was involved in the murders of her family and other Osage people. And to add more heartbreak, their youngest daughter passes away. Molly, justifiably horrified by what Ernest has done, decides to part ways with him. In the end, justice prevails, as both Hale and Ernest are sent off to prison for their crimes, with Ernest admitting his guilt in the death of Rita, his own sister-in-law, and her family. What a roller coaster of emotions, right? William Hale and Ernest Burkhart's plans for the Osage wipeout explained, back in the late 1890s, the Osage Nation struck it rich when they stumbled upon oil on their land, making them pretty darn wealthy. To make sure their land and fortune stayed within tribal control, the Osage were granted these things called head rights, which could be passed down through the family. Now, these head rights are at the very heart of William King Hale's diabolical plan. This guy basically wanted Molly's entire family 6 feet under so that he could inherit all those head rights and swim in the wealth. So he recruits Ernest into his twisted scheme, and that's why he tied the knot with Molly in the first place. But here's the kicker. Hale probably intended to off Ernest too, just so he didn't have to share the money with his own nephew. See, one person could inherit multiple head rights, and that's where the greed factor kicks in. Hale, being a real snake in the grass, thought he could pull off this crazy plan because he had embedded himself deep within the Osage Nation community. He played the whole Mr. Nice Guy act, befriending the tribal council and other Osage folks, lending money, opening local businesses, and investing in the community like he's some kind of saint. Plus, he had local law enforcement wrapped around his finger, so he thought he could get away with anything. All of this allowed him to pretend to be a buddy to the Osage while secretly plotting their demise. Hale's scheme was basically fueled by greed, and Ernest, well, he was in it for the moolah too. So while Hale pretended to be a friend, deep down, he didn't believe that the Osage deserved to have any wealth or prosperity. So messed up. Why does Ernest testify against his uncle? Ernest found himself in quite the pickle when the FBI nabbed Blackie Thompson, and the guy spilled the beans on who paid him to take out Henry Roan and even reached out to Kirby to off Rita. Now, while a tiny part of Ernest might have twinged with guilt for his part in those Osage murders, he also knew he was cornered with no easy way out of the investigation. So he figured he'd be the star witness at the trial, crossing his fingers for a lighter punishment. But here's where the plot thickens. Ernest faced the devastating loss of his youngest daughter, and he had this epiphany that his uncle Hale barely cared about what went down. That was the final straw that broke the camel's back, pushing him to spill the beans to the judge and jury. At that point, he might have felt like he had nothing left to lose, especially since Molly wasn't even talking to him anymore, let alone standing by his side. So even though Killers of the Flower Moon makes it clear that Hale was the mastermind, Ernest was no innocent bystander. He was knee-deep in this mess. Why did the Osage people never suspect William or Ernest? Watching Killers of the Flower Moon is a wild ride because Martin Scorsese flips the script right from the get-go. He shows us the culprits, and we're left in suspense as we watch the whole drama unfold. What's crazy is that Molly Burkhart and the entire Osage Nation put their trust in Hale and Ernest. I mean, Hale was like Mr. Popular, well-liked and respected. He had everyone fooled into thinking he was the most trustworthy guy in town. He even pretended to help in the hunt for Anna's killer, so it's no wonder the Osage never suspected him during that reign of terror. And then there's Molly, who genuinely believed that Ernest was as harmless as a teddy bear. She thought he loved her and would never dream of causing harm to her or their little ones. Can you imagine? They were married for a solid decade before the big truth bomb dropped. What Ernest and Hale did was basically the ultimate betrayal and a complete breach of trust, especially to the Osage, who had been nothing but kind to them. Wrap your head around this. Having someone so close to you commit such dark deeds is just mind-boggling. Plus, the Osage were pretty scared to speak out against Hale, fearing some serious payback. It's a real-life thriller right there. What have they changed from the book? Killers of the Flower Moon is one of those films rooted in real events, and it leans heavily on David Grann's book from 2017, which delved into the chilling Osage Nation murders. Now, here's the twist. Unlike the book, the movie doesn't keep us guessing about the culprits. It puts all the cards on the table right from the beginning. In the book, it's all about the FBI investigation, with characters like Molly and Ernest kind of hanging out on the sidelines. But when Marty Scorsese got his hands on it, he decided to flip the script. He shines a spotlight on Molly's family and her tumultuous relationship with Ernest in the midst of all these gruesome tragedies. And while Jesse Plemons takes center stage as Tom White in the movie, the book has a slightly different focus. It's a classic case of how the director's vision can really change the whole perspective of a story. Molly Burkhart's guardianship explained. In Killers of the Flower Moon, there's this recurring theme where Molly keeps asking to use her own money for various important things, like her mom's medicine, or to travel to Washington, D.C. to have a chat with President Coolidge about those gruesome murders. These scenes really highlight the kind of guardianship that Molly and the Osage Nation were stuck in. It's kind of like a conservatorship, you know, where they're basically deemed incompetent if they couldn't pass this competency test Congress put out in 1921. What happened next is a real head-scratcher. They handed over the keys to non-Osage folks, mainly white guardians, who got control over Osage's finances. But here's the kicker. They needed permission for every dime they spent. So even though Molly and the Osage were sitting on a pot of oil money, they couldn't just use it as they pleased under this guardianship. Talk about frustrating. The worst part is that some of these guardians were in cahoots with the bad guys, getting wrapped up in those sinister plans to kill for the head rights inheritance. It's a real mess. But the good news is that Molly wasn't one to back down. In 1931, she took matters into her own hands and sued to end this guardianship madness. And guess what? She won. Now, that's what I call a victory against the odds. What happens to Ernest, William, Molly, and the Osage after the film? So, after Ernest spilled the beans about his involvement in those murders, Molly gave him the boot and remarried in 1928, tying the knot with John William Cobb. Her kids were seriously impacted by all the craziness, especially with their own dad caught up in the murders of their aunts. Molly managed to free herself from the whole guardian system headache and lived a fairly quiet life for a few years until she passed away in 1937 at just 50 years old. Her children inherited her estate, but the Osage oil money started to dwindle over time. Molly's granddaughter, Margie Burkhart, still resides in Oklahoma, keeping that family connection alive. Now, as for the bad guys, after the trial, Ernest and Hale were both handed life sentences behind bars. Ernest got a taste of freedom in 1937, which, coincidentally, was the year Molly passed away. But then he pulled a stunt, robbing his own sister-in-law, Lily, which led to his parole being revoked. Ernest had another shot at freedom in 1957, and he tried to reconnect with his son, James, but the wounds were too deep, and James couldn't forgive his dad. Ernest eventually played his cards right and managed to secure a pardon in 1966. It was granted due to his cooperation with the FBI and his testimony that pointed fingers at his and Hale's roles in the murders. He kicked the bucket in 1986. Now, Hale, on the other hand, never admitted to any guilt or openly expressed remorse for his dark deeds. After a bunch of trials, he was found guilty and slapped with a life sentence. But here's the twist. He wiggled his way out on parole in 1947 and ended up settling down in Arizona a few years later. Hale's chapter closed in 1962. The whole story's like something out of a gritty crime novel, isn't it? The deeper significance of the Osage tragedies. The impact of those gruesome murders ran deep within the Osage Nation, leaving a lasting scar for generations. It's not just a crime story, it's a stark revelation of the racist practices that allowed Hale to exploit their trust. Killers of the Flower Moon puts it all on display. See, if the Osage had been given control over their own money, without those pesky guardianships, they might not have fallen prey to such manipulation. Those guardianships and the theft of Osage land, money, and lives are like a spotlight on the broader issue of unjust treatment of indigenous populations in the U.S. It's a harsh reminder of how the Osage murders were rooted in white supremacy and pure hatred. It's a sad chapter in history that we can't forget, and movies like this help us see it for what it was. The movie continues Martin Scorsese's post-credits tradition. You know, the decision to skip the post-credits scene in Killers of the Flower Moon doesn't really come as a surprise. Martin Scorsese, the director behind it, has never been into the whole post-credits shindig. No tease for a sequel, no funny quip, nada. He's just not into the franchise game, and he's even been the guy to squash The Departed 2. Honestly, it's hard to argue that any of Scorsese's flicks really need an after-credits scene. So, Killers of the Flower Moon, not having one fits right in. Scorsese's movies are all about their own story and style. It's pretty safe to say that we probably won't see a post-credits scene from the man anytime soon. His movies just don't vibe with that kind of thing. In a weird way, the absence of after-credits scenes almost makes his films stand out more. If Killers of the Flower Moon did have one, it might feel like a forced extra or an attempt to play around with the whole post-credits scene trend. Scorsese seems to prefer keeping things pure and simple. That brings us to the end of today's video. What did you think about this film? Let us know in the comments below, and if you haven't already, then please like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.